Hi, and welcome to episode 2. And in this episode, we're going to stick with Houdon. And in the Louvre, there are so many amazing sculpts by him. And here's one of Benjamin Franklin that's very famous and well known. I'm just going to let this little video run. It's kind of behind glass here, obviously, so forgive the glare. But I was able to get some good 3D capture of this guy. And one of the things that Houdon's really known for are his eyes, really beautiful rendering of very realistic and soulful eyes. And so you can see that here in Franklin here, and also right behind him is a sculpture of Diderot. This was sort of a breakthrough sculpture for him, and it's just this idea of this sculpture of a character that's about to speak. The lips are slightly parted. It's really a revolutionary sculpture here. But we're looking at Franklin right now, and let's take a look at the data that I got from him. So here we see the Houdon capture. This is with using 123D Catch, which is it's really good, and there's a little bit of chatter, obviously, and a lot of missing spots. There's a big kind of bump on the top of the head, etc. But one of the things I want to really look at here is the idea of trying to think about simple shapes. Now, actually, right now, this is January of 2017. I am taking Scott Eaton's facial anatomy class online, and it's amazing. So I'm learning a lot and looking at this with new eyes in terms of all the construction that's going on under here with the anatomy. Anatomy is equally as important as knowing how to render forms, but I just wanted to mention that class is definitely worth taking. But one of the things I can do to kind of help us see the simplified forms is I made a duplicate here of Ben, and this one is really sandblasted, and obviously you don't see any of the details, and now you're looking at a lot of the major forms. Now, generally, because all the forms have been rendered, it's a little bit inclusive of some of the secondary shapes, as I mentioned, but we can definitely still see the primary shapes. So one of the main ones, let's say at the frontal bone here on the front of the forehead. And of course, when we look at this, it's a rather large form, and what we're looking for are a few things to me is this arch right here, and the general shape and the change of plane right here. That's really important. Of course, then you've got the brow ridge itself coming across here. That's a very simple primary form. The sort of large cheekbone area, and of course the general sort of triangle shape, wedge shape of the nose, the sort of barrel shape or half barrel shape of the muzzle, and of course sort of a half a semicircle here of the chin. And so obviously very large forms. These are the basic things we want to look for. And of course the other things we want to look for are in the eyes and how the eyes fit within the sockets. There's a whole lot of detail in there that we could get into. So another large shape to look out for here in the hair, for example, is just the organization of this form. So obviously here's a big large lock of hair, and he's got it going and flowing down. But what's really interesting to look at, if you look at this overall lock of this form here, is how this tends to spin around and kind of break the surface and sort of essentially helix around itself. Now there's multiple shapes going on. I would consider actually this as one shape, and this is a sub shape coming off of it. But the thing to really kind of look out for me is that the overall shape has this sort of twisting and helixing effect going on. So when we go from those very large forms, now we come down to some secondary forms. We'll look at the eyelids and eyeballs, for example. And here we see the placement of those and the very clean forms. One of the things that is very important to get right are the placement of the eyes within the socket. And obviously, one of these things that you can look for is if you think of a map here, like a north, south, east, west on the eyelids. If you then think of which one of these is pointing forward and in what order. So, for example, the upper lid points the most forward, then the lower lid, then the inside corner, then the outside corner. And that creates this sort of plane and an orientation, the angle on the face, for example. And so that's a really important thing to get right. So to try and illustrate this a little bit better, I wanted to show you, I made this little sort of grid with essentially a north, south, east, and west. And what I'm showing here is that as you project north, south, east, and west forward towards the nose, which one is the furthest forward? So again, it's the idea of the upper lid is furthest out, then the lower lid, then the inner corner, then the outer corner, and you end up with a plane something like this, where from the side there's a downward tilt, and from the top there's also a tilt towards the back. So you get this very specific angle. The other thing is typically there's also an angle from the inner to the outer corner, in that normally the outer corner is slightly higher than the inner corner to varying degrees. I think Scott was telling me it's somewhere around 4 degrees, something like that. But Houdon's rendered it rather flat here, horizontal. So that's okay. We're just going to go with that. The more important thing is that the idea that the eye doesn't sit completely flat across the face, that those corners tend to have, again, this angle going back on the outside corner and angling down from the side here, and that is our placement. Again, this is a general rule and can be broken, but as long as you know what you're looking for, this will help you look for variations and deviations from the norm. And also to consider when you're making these eyelid forms that, there's an eyeball sitting under here. And as I've been learning from Scott in his class, there are these things called tarsal plates, which are these sort of fibrous doodads here that the skin of the eyelid attaches to. These are kind of stiff little plasticky bits that wrap onto the eyeball. And what that essentially does is creates a sort of a consistent thickness where there's a plane change here. And you have a very specific thickness that's visible, and the upper lid is usually thicker than the lower lid. And actually, because of that thickness, overlaps the lower lid a little bit, typically. And so we see that we've got this sort of semicircular crescent shape here. And again, that's that idea of having very specific, discrete forms that blend one into the next. Now, actually, on the lower lid, it's about a third the size of the upper lid. So here we see a form of the lid itself, and then here's another sort of eye bag with fat in it. So this is a little planar, kind of rectilinear plane changes here. And then this guy is obviously like a little bean shape. And that idea of the belly of the curve, well, typically because of gravity, the eye bag has its belly of the curve a little bit below the halfway point. You can see here it kind of sags a little bit, right? So that's what you want to look for. Same thing with the upper lid and the fat above it. This is always, to some degree or another, convex, and you've got other forms in here that are the sort of fat areas. So these are sort of starting to break down what generally can be looked at as a pretty simple plane change here and an overall bulge of the eye. Then coming into the secondary forms, once you have all these in place, these various planes, then you start breaking that down to its secondary forms, and then down into the little tertiary forms of these little crow's feet. These are like little tubes here. And so on, forever and ever. You've got the nose, overall, obviously very large, simplified form here. Then riding on top of that, you've got these other subforms. Here's sort of an ovoid shape where the bridge of the nose is, the glabella up here, which I'm going to draw first as, one big wedge shape, but then within that are little subforms. So you can just see how it goes on and on and on, but you need to have those first large shapes in place for all of these little guys to make any sort of sense. Here's another sort of form here. Then you've got the general ball of the nose itself. Then you've got the wing of the nostril. And the wing of the nose is a great one to figure out all these detective work. It's very isolated. Here's your boundary. You've got your cross section as it's sort of a softer curve and then wraps under. And where that transition is, that radius change, that sort of indicates the belly of the curve. And maybe the sort of apex of it right here, about 2/3 of the way back on the nostril. Hopefully this gives you a good example of simple, large forms that have to be in place before you get to your secondary and tertiary forms. All right, well that's it for Ben and me. Hopefully that was helpful, and see you on the next Sculpt tour. Okay, thanks, bye.